Hello, everyone. From London, good afternoon. I'm Edward Lucas. I'm a senior fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's discussion on debunking Putin's victory myth. Many of you will have watched Red Square this morning with this extraordinarily lackluster spectacle with no fly path, a very haphazard collection of tanks, and a very unimpressive speech from the commander-in-chief, Vladimir Putin, all the more interesting because of the lack of the General Gerasimov, who is supposedly the military mastermind behind Russia's armed forces. So there's a lot to think about on that, but perhaps much more important is the whole role that May the 9th and the kind of victory cult plays in legitimizing the Kremlin's place in the world and legitimizing the attack on Ukraine. We're joined by a fantastic panel who could fill the next 10 hours, not just the next 1 hour that we have in front of us. They include or comprise Julia Davis, who is a columnist on the Daily Beast and has the most excellent Twitter feed on Russian news, which gives a quick English language summaries of everything that's important. Today, Julia highlighted the way in which a Russian satellite TV menu had been hacked with a very pungent anti-war message inserted there, no doubt to the dismay of the Kremlin. We have Susan Glasser, a former Moscow correspondent. She and I overlapped long ago, and she has just emerged from the book cave, the book writing cave, with her book on 4 years of Trump called The Divider, which we are all looking forward to very much indeed. We have Her Excellency Tytti Tuppurainen, who is a minister in the Finnish government and minister for the European affairs and ownership steering, which I have a feeling it involves making things even more efficient, but we will find that. And Minister Tuppurainen is normally obviously based in Helsinki, but she's actually in Washington, D.C. right now. We have also my old friend, David Kramer, last but not least, known to many of people watching, I suspect, from his role at the McCain Institute, but he's now the Bradford M. Freeman Managing Director for Global Policy at the George W. Bush Institute, and you're all very welcome. And we have, I forgot, but last but not least, of course, we have Natalia Gomeniuk, who's joining us from Kiev. Natalia, welcome to you. Natalia is a journalist who specializes in foreign affairs and conflict reporting. She's the author of 3 books, the founder of Public Interest Journalism Lab, and also co-founder and chair of the public television NGO Hromadski. So, Natalia, I want to come to you first. I have this feeling that whenever we talk about Kiev, I want the Ukrainian voices to be up there first and foremost, telling us what's going on. What is your interpretation of today's events from your vantage point in Kiev?
Probably, to be absolutely honest, we had quite a concerning day because knowing how abused was the myth of the 9th of May by the Russian government, the idea that there should be something happening here all over the country is still there. Fortunately, it's still 6 p.m. and we are quite good, to be honest. Kiev, there is no real all-day curfew, but there was concerns about, airstrikes on the major towns, especially those towns which were very important during the Second World War, like Dnipro, Kharkiv, and especially Odessa. Really, I want to say, I wish it won't happen because this day is still unfolding. And as well, we remember that, for instance, the attack on Ukraine started on the 24th of February, and 23rd of February was this Soviet Army Day. So wherever the next day is coming, but it's quite a benchmark day for the Ukrainians because the Kiev mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, for instance, says that if things are okay, that would be the time when we would call people back, come and welcome to the town, because so far, despite maybe 1 million of Kievites, according to the government, returned since the beginning of the invasion. The women or elderly or kids were not really invited to be back. So that was our feeling. At the same time, we still have this very huge concern over the situation in the Azov steel plant in Mariupol, because the concern was that we know that it's now, paratroopers and the Ukrainian National Guard members including of the Azov battalion, are fighting there. They are asking for bringing at least hundreds of the people who are wounded out of the basement of that steel. There are a lot of humanitarian missions involved into letting them out, but it's kind of feeling that it could be also the symbolic murder, of this regiment in particular, because it was so demonized by the Russian propaganda. So it implies quite a practical fear in Ukraine, an absolutely practical, instrumental, that despite it's not the curfew, the people said, like, better stay home today, better don't go to the office. At the same time, it's still an important day for Ukrainians, as, just add something. I'm born in '83, and all the Soviet preservation of the history is still my part of my bringing up. So Soviet holidays, the 9th of May, it's something important to family, to my family, to all my friends. And probably, when we were in our teens, we didn't care that much. It was something from the old time, but now it really feels important. Because when I travel, just to finalize very shortly, when I travel now around the country, there were all those places which were told from the school. You remember that they saw, like, oh, that battle was taking place there. And you don't really care when you are a teenager. For instance, the town of Izum. And now when a reporter are going to those places, because of the terrain, the attacks are exactly in those towns. That should be the Korsun, that would be Izum, all other, those which are not important from economical point of view, a significant points of the Second World War. And unfortunately, these are exactly the places where the big battle's taking right now. So this comparison makes you really feel absolutely strongly about the victory of the Ukrainians and the Soviets in the Second World War. So it all has such a strong meanings. So all those things which maybe in the 90s didn't mean that much for already our generation, for a lot of Ukrainians matter like incredibly. So it's quite a special day.
Well, thanks so much for that, Natalia. And if anyone hasn't watched President Zelensky's video where he walks through a deserted but very clean street in the middle of Kiev with an extraordinary 5 or 6 minute reflection on the significance of May the 9th and how the Ukrainians will not allow Russia to take away the memory of Ukrainian heroism in the anti-Hitler coalition, nor will it allow the anti-Nazi cause to be instrumentalized as a means of attacking Ukraine now. I strongly recommend that video, even by the extremely high standards of Zelensky's videos. This is an absolute stunner. I think it should win a prize of some kind. I want to come next to you, to Minister Tuppurainen next, because of course, Finland has been at peace since 1945, but your experience of the Second World War era, and I say era because it wasn't quite the Second World War for you, is also very deep and very sharp and very painful. Not many people would know in a pop quiz that if you ask which of the 3 European capitals from combatant countries that were not occupied by enemy forces during the Second World War, one of them is London, the second is Moscow, and the third, of course, is Helsinki. And you had both the Winter War and the Continuation War. What does May the 9th is celebrated in Finland as Europe Day, and you then, I think, have the your real military commemoration day. I think is the 3rd Sunday in May, where you reflect and remember the fallen. So, Minister, give us your take on what does May the 9th mean for you, and particularly what do you think of the way in which the Putin regime has been weaponizing it?
Well, the 9th of May for us Finns is mainly nowadays the Europe Day. We celebrate European Union and its achievements in the world, uniting this continent of Europe and creating peace and stability. Let's not forget that it has been given the Nobel Peace Prize, for maintaining peace for such a long time. So we Finns feel that this Monday, 9th of May, is mostly a day to celebrate the EU. And since 1995, Finland has been member in the EU. And for us, that meant a very decisive step to be part of the Western sphere. So from that moment on, we were no longer neutral, meaning, somehow being between East and West. Since our membership in the EU, we have been firmly rooted in the West. So the significance of the EU membership is very crucial to us Finns. But also having mentioned the Winter War, now the war that is waged in Ukraine, it is something that we Finns really feel painfully. We feel for you Ukrainians because it has so many similarities. There's this small country, or bigger than Finland, but nevertheless smaller than Russia, fighting bravely against a big aggressor. So that's what happened also during our Winter War, 1939. 105 days of glory. We kept the Russians away. We were not occupied, but it did not come easy. And actually, the reason that Russia agreed to cease fire and peace negotiations was the fear that Great Britain and France would send troops to Finland. So it was not only us Finns who, managed to contain and keep Russia away, but there were also factors related to the Second World War and its events. So the things that are going on in Ukraine, we really believe that Ukraine is fighting the bravest possible war against Russia. It is a war that has to do also with ideas and values. Wars are not only weights on soil, they are also weights on ideas. And therefore, we really stand with Ukraine because you deserve democracy, you deserve your sovereignty, you deserve freedom, and that is what's at stake also in this war. Russia is certainly not going to win.
Well, thank you so much, Minister, for those rousing words. And I do recommend that everyone should just acquaint or reacquaint themselves with Finnish history. It's not something that forms part of mainstream Finnish, mainstream history curriculums for those who study history, but it is well worth just getting into the internet, or even doing it old style and buying a book or two to read up on the geopolitical predicament that Finland was in during the war and the way in which they fought the Russians, and also the extraordinary events of the 1950s when you came very close to losing the independence that you fought for so hard. I want to come to David Kramer next. David, you know this inside out from your position in both academia and in government. Do you have any reflections on the way in which the victory myth or the cult of 9th of May, or however you call it, has developed over the Putin years, which you've watched? And what do you think of the vulnerabilities, if there are vulnerabilities in this that we could exploit?
Well, I think we've seen, Edward, an expropriation, if you will, of the history of World War II, where Putin has tried to portray it as a Russian victory, and without really any Western or American help in it, without giving credit to Ukrainians or Belarusians or others. And of course, when it comes to measuring the toll in percentage terms, more Ukrainians, more Belarusians suffered than did Russians in World War II. And so Putin has tried to present this as a Russian victory, along with his whitewashing of Stalin. And I think this is a reflection of his efforts to create this myth, this cult of personality that he hopes to follow himself. It also reflects in his narrative that the United States played virtually no role in this, that this was something that Russia did on its own. But I think what's also striking about today, May 9th, 2022, is his speech, as you described it, was lackluster, uninspiring, and certainly not a motivating speech for his forces. And it lacked any declaration of war. It lacked any declaration of a mobilization of Russian forces. It also lacked any declaration of victory, not even over Kherson or Mariupol. And so it seemed to reflect perhaps a belated recognition on Putin's part that this campaign, since it's not called a war in Russia, that this special operation is not going well. And it's, I think, now even unavoidable for Putin to come to that realization that this campaign is not going well. And I think it's time for people, not only in Ukraine, who have shown tremendous heroism and courage throughout this campaign, but people elsewhere, to start thinking of a scenario in which the Russian military campaign actually collapses and that the Ukrainians are victorious. And by that, I mean pushing the Russian forces out of Ukrainian territory. And so I think this speech today will go down as what it lacked, not what it provided. And it will not help the cause that Putin has been pushing of making Russia the big and only victor from World War II.
Let me just follow up on that quickly, David, because there's a particular element to this, which is the kind of the use of the word Nazi and denazification, which has become become central to the whole sort of Kremlin discourse on this. You and I expect many people watching the call will remember there have been haphazard attempts to elevate Nazism to a sort of present day threat. We had something called World Against Nazism and various other things, but it hasn't in previous years. It's been there since the beginning of the Putin era, but it was very haphazard and ineffective. And now it's become the sort of the central element of the discourse. We're fighting Nazis. And there's two problems with that. One is that obviously it's not true. The second is that it implies that there is no way out other than total victory for the Kremlin. So if there was some peace deal involving going back to the pre-February 23rd contact lines, for example, and any of these other things being talked about, it's going to be very hard for Putin to do any deal like that if he's saying that my enemies are the Nazis, which, as everybody knows, is the absolute epitome of evil, particularly in the Russian sort of mindscape.
Yeah, I agree, Edward. I mean, it has been one of several different rationales provided by Putin and the Kremlin for the invasion of Ukraine, the war against Ukraine. And it is inconvenient for the Kremlin narrative that the president of Ukraine is Jewish, that Ukraine is known as one of the least anti-Semitic countries in Europe, that the prime minister has been Jewish in Ukraine. It's not to sweep the history in Ukraine toward Jews under the rug, but it isn't even meant in that sense. Although Sergei Lavrov, the loathsome Russian foreign minister, kind of tripped over the message and angered Israel when he made comments that Zelensky could be, in fact, a leading Nazi, even though he is Jewish, and that Hitler had Jewish blood. So they can't even keep the narrative straight, as absurd as it is. And that's in part because there is no justification. There is no reason for what Putin decided to do starting on February 24th, although obviously it goes back to 2014 and even before that. So I do think that the Russian narrative doesn't hold up. I don't think it's actually having the impact on the Russian people as they had hoped it would, and that it is falling apart just as the military campaign is falling apart.
Julia, let me come to you next. You tweeted very movingly today that you, growing up in the USSR, you watched Victory Day parades filled with pride for your Ukrainian and Russian grandparents who fought so bravely, and the main emotion you feel now is relief that your grandparents aren't here to see what Russia has become and what it's doing to Ukraine. If you have a very fine focused view of the Russian media. Do you see any signs that the rivets are popping, that this kind of narrative is coming undone? I've been very struck to see the sort of explicit rehabilitation of Stalinism. I think it was on Solovyov's program a couple of nights ago. Someone was saying what we need is a new Beria. Only that will prevent us from public disorder in the face of shortages. But tell us, what have you noticed in your study of the Russian media space over the past few weeks?
It's become quite apparent that the initial narrative is not holding water, and that's why they're continuing to try to reiterated, even including to Putin's today's speech for May 9th. He's still trying to justify this invasion, still trying to promote this Nazi narrative. But what's interesting is it's so obvious that people aren't buying it that they had to pervert and rewrite what the word Nazi even means. And lately they are claiming that Nazism is no longer perceived, at least in their version of the events, as anti-Semitism. But now they say you could be a Nazi against the Russians and against anything Russian. So they're trying to pervert and distort that term to suit Putin's agenda. And in that sense, they're claiming that anyone who opposes Russian aggression, including Ukrainians themselves and anyone who is helping them defend themselves, can now be described as the Nazis. So they're completely perverting that term, completely perverting history. He's trying to steal not only the future from his own people and from the Ukrainians, but also their past, attempting to rewrite the past, reappropriate the terms like Nazism and genocide. And even in talking about world events, they're attempting to portray the Soviet Union and Russia as totally blameless in any conflicts, including the Winter War with Finland. Last night on the Sunday evening with Vladimir Solovyov, they actually blamed Finland for being responsible even for that war. And it's mind-boggling, but this is what they're doing. And the head of RT, Margarita Simonian, wished that their internet was more like the Chinese system so that they could totally prevent any truth from seeping in, and they could completely control the narrative internally, because people are using VPNs, people still have access to the truth. Obviously, enough people know history, they're not getting away with it, and that's why Putin in his deflated speech was still trying to justify his unjustifiable war of aggression against Ukraine.
Thanks so much for that, Julia. Let me turn to Susan next. In your excellent book, Kremlin Rising, that you wrote with Peter Baker, what must be nearly 20 years ago now, even back then you spotted the way in which the veterans of World War II and the memory of World War II was a sort of important part of the Kremlin cocktail. And in those days, it worked quite well in the West. It was one of the things that Russia had on its side, was to be able to say we were all wartime allies together. And there was some resonance in that. From where you sit in Washington, D.C., how do you see the Russian war myth landing on American decision makers and opinion formers? Does that still resonate, or is there have they burnt that asset by overusing it? And more generally, what do you think the American public opinion and informed opinion is making of May the 9th now? You're on mute, Susan.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear from you and from everyone today. I do especially agree with your point that regardless of what Putin did or didn't say today, by framing the war itself in such grandiose and even existential terms as one of conflict with Nazism itself in its sort of bizarrely resurrected form, he has made it very, very hard to envision a negotiated end to the conflict. He's made it very hard to see that there is any kind of face-saving thing. And of course, for those of us here in Washington, we've watched literally for 2 decades, every act of Kremlin aggression under Putin has been met with sort of wishful thinking around off ramps and exit ramps, and how were we going to sort of compel behavior in a way that suggests that we just fundamentally have not understood the levers of power in Putin's Russia really from the beginning. And so I think that's why you now see a kind of a newfound realism seeping in, perhaps very belatedly and at the cost of a horrible number of Ukrainian lives, I do think you see, certainly from the Biden administration, a new sense of, not being taken in. You don't hear a lot of discussion at this point around how we're going to negotiate with Putin, or, what the sanctions are going to do in terms of compelling Putin's decision making. And that, I think, is why you also have seen this willingness on the part of Biden to kind of up the ante when it comes to military assistance to the Ukrainians, when it comes to even a reframing of Western goals at this moment in time. I think that reflects basically an assessment that you can't negotiate with Putin over existential goals that he has cast in these kind of dire World War II redux terms. And so that is something that's different that I see now compared with previous years. I would say that this opaqueness and this inability of Washington to really understand what's going on with the Kremlin and with Russia has continued. And if anything, we seem to have fewer tools and less ability to really smartly read Putin and those around him than at any time one can remember with this or previous Soviet leaderships. It's really quite notable, it seems to me, how little one understands right now who, if anyone, is actually influencing Putin. And I think the uncertainty around May 9th is a good example of that. And everything from a major mobilization and full out war and, outright kind of nuclear mobilization to the nothing burger that it appears to be has been talked about here in Washington because there's so little clear sense of what is really going on with Vladimir Putin. So I think that sense of humbleness and humility is an important one going forward. This is a moment for not really understanding why this war is happening. But just the final point I would make goes to this question of the cult of World War II victory as central to Putin and how he's presented himself. I do think that it goes back to how Putin came to power in the late 1990s. And that was at the same time as it became abundantly clear that there was really very little that held together the post-Soviet Russian state aside from this cult of victory in World War II, that had become even more important to what remained of Russian national identity after the Soviet collapse. And therefore, when Putin emerges into this public role, at the time he becomes the head of the FSB and then prime minister, is exactly this moment when it is literally only World War II victory that is seen as sort of helping the otherwise non-cohering Russian state to hold together. And so I think he's going to abandon that never, if he can. And that may be why, in fact, he's wary of reframing war goals around the war with Ukraine today, because in fact, this is at the core of Russian identity. And so to try to revise that and to have it incorporate more broadly his war with Ukraine, I think was very risky for Putin. And so in that sense, perhaps not a surprise that he didn't do so. But finally, that image, that insane image of Putin paying tribute to the hero cities of World War II, including Kyiv, today, it reflects a fundamental perversion that is at the heart of this war. And I think we can't begin or end any conversation should always include that. I mean, it is literally insane for Putin to be talking about denazifying Ukraine as the basis for this war.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Susan. And so I think we've established a basis for the second half of the discussion here, which is that the myth is absolutely vital, not just for the war in Ukraine, but also for it's part of Russia's, not just part, it's the basis of Russia's, under Putin, its national identity. And of course, the myth is very vulnerable. It wasn't just Russians who won the war. That's been touched on already. The war was not a simple two-sided black against white conflict, as the Finnish guest has pointed out. It was a much more complicated 3 or even sometimes 4-sided war. And we in the West have sometimes fallen into the trap of accepting a kind of Soviet goodies and baddies version, which ignores things like, for example, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the way in which Hitler and Stalin were friends before they were foes. And there's also something which we haven't really touched on, which is the aftermath of the war was not really liberation for the countries of the eastern half of Europe. It was that one occupation gave way to another. And this is perhaps the most devastating bit for the Russians now, is that although they thought they came as liberators, in the eyes of the people who they were liberating, they actually came as conquerors and occupiers to a large extent. So I want to come back. I'm going to come to Natalia first, and then Tytti, Minister Tuppurainen. What does the West need to understand about the Second World War differently in order that we are not vulnerable to the Putin's use of the May 9th and the victory myth? Natalia, you're on mute.
There is no way for me not to compare this war as a Ukrainian. I remain very cautious for the last years, and the journalists covering conflicts, I'm extremely cautious about comparing the war anywhere to the Second World War. However, it's striking how, oddly enough, maybe using its own myth, the Russians, the Kremlin is kind of mirroring what the Germans did. Maybe unconsciously, maybe cautiously, maybe consciously, maybe it's just their own role model how to fight the war, so they do what the Germans do. I was stricken how in the villages which were liberated in Chernihiv region, in Kiev region, but elsewhere where I was, the people, especially elderly, were calling the Russian soldiers Germans. We're a bit puzzled as a journalist first arriving, because when those people say like, and when the Germans were here, and we said like, what? That's how deep to the memory it's coming. I think what is also very interesting, and I would also refer, I've just done a report which should be soon published, a dispatch on the Jewish community in Dnipro, which is quite vivid. And when I talked to one of the chief rabbis, he always said, especially for the Western audience, saying that like when the American reporters are coming to Ukraine, in particular, they do come to Babi Yar, and that's absolutely right. But they often search just for the past. However, the Jewish community here in Ukraine is developing. It has its present and it has its future. So for instance, out of almost non-existing Jewish community in Dnipro, we have quite a blossoming community with maybe 80,000 people living in the city, with the, synagogues, with the celebrations. And that's quite an unfortunate that they need to escape. So when for instance, my team, we talked to the assistant of a rabbi in Mariupol who needed to escape, that's what was happening, that horrors, to Vinnytsia. So these parallels are absolutely instrumental to Ukraine, and that for Ukrainians, it's nothing but people's war. And again, like from the Jewish community to any other Crimean Tatar community, this is a clear case for them. Something to speak about the West, and what I understand from talking to quite a lot of people all over the country, I think there is, we usually, and especially the Western audience, often, look at the war today as to the recent wars they had when there was maybe a civic conflict or something like that. So they do not fully understand. So what the call is like that of course, today we do have a legit army fighting, and sometimes saving life is indeed the military support. Something else probably I just missed because it's so obvious for us. You were talking about the Western participation and misunderstanding of how Russia tries to present the Second World War. I think the important thing to understand that the most of the military actions were taking place on the Ukrainian territory. The most of the soldiers fighting in the Second World War, winning the, overthrowing the Nazis, were Ukrainians. And even if there were some wrongdoings which were pretty demonized, that's the job of the Ukrainian society to work with it, like any society which has, what French people lived through. If we're speaking about the collaboration, being collaborators of the Nazis, that's something which Ukrainians are kind of lived through as well. My short and last remark, I think what's something to think about now, and what we all think all the time, a lot of international institutions like UN, like later the European Union, were founded after the Second World War to avoid something like that. What Ukrainians feel today, that all those institutions are powerless in doing that. Moreover, UN is indeed absolutely abused. So the gains of the Soviet Union in the Second World War are currently abused by Russia, by all their veto power. And that's not just the case of Ukraine, but other conflicts. So the idea that I think the most important thing is the world order of peace, which had been built after the Second War by creating a lot of institutions which are existing, it's broken. It don't exist. So that should be something debated about like that. And it's not just not working, it's also abused.
Thank you. I want to go back to Finland now and drill down a little bit more on this question of whether history is a national security or historiography. Technically, we're talking about, which is the way we think about history rather than the history itself, is a national security vulnerability. And I know Finland has tremendous experience in building social cohesion and sort of emotional, psychological resilience to attack. You have this wonderful untranslatable word, sisu. When you look at the way Finns think about history, Minister, is there any lesson in that for other countries that we could help boost our resilience to Russian weaponization of history, such as the Victory Cult and May the 9th?
Well, there are many lessons to be learned, but let me remind you that Finns are also the happiest nation in the world. So what makes us happy is high trust on institutions and high equality in the society. Finland is a very egalitarian society, and we have been building our Nordic modern welfare state for decades. And that creates the very foundation of our resilience and our preparedness when it comes to all kinds of crises. But let me come back to your initial question about the lessons learned from the Second World War and its aftermath. After the Second World War, the world was more or less split into two. It was marked by the beginning of the so-called the Cold War. Two blocks, the one led by United States, the free world, and then the bloc led by Soviet Union and led by force and military power and totalitarian regime. Now, perhaps Putin wants to create some kind of a, parallelism between the situation, but that's not the case today. We are not in the Cold War, not even close to a situation like that. Russia is not able to create any bloc anymore. It is a declining regional superpower that wants to stick to its military power and manifest its military power by waging war in Ukraine. But Russia is isolating itself. It's more or less alone. Of course, there are some countries that hadn't taken so clear positions, but nevertheless, in the big picture, the world is united against Russia and its ruthless war in Ukraine. So this is not about war between East and West. This is not about war between Russia-led world and the rest. This is simply an illegal war in Ukraine where Russia is clearly violating every international law, every piece of UN chapter. And what we are doing in our response, we are very prudently acting according to international law. Our reaction is totally compatible with UN Charter and so on. That is our strength. We stick to our principles. They are the principles of the European Union and the Western world. We follow the law, we stick the rule of law principle, and we want to enhance and promote the values of freedom and equality in a way that is suitable for our means that are available.
Thanks very much. Well, I always, on December the 5th, feel rather sad because that was the day that Britain declared war on Finland in 1941, which we didn't need to do. And I hope by next December the 5th, you'll be safely inside NATO and we'll have that to celebrate instead.
Yes, that is a decision that we are considering very thoroughly at the moment. And even when we are going to make the decision, it will be solidly from our own national interest. It is not a reaction, immediately to Russia's war in Ukraine. It is our own decision that we will make out of our interests.
Yes, well, of course, the trouble is that Russia has changed the way in which your interests are manifested and perceived by by this insane war. I want to come back next to Susan, I think, and you've looked at the Trump administration very closely, and you've seen the way in which crazy nonsense can be taken as true just because the top guy says it and everyone else then makes themselves believe it. Were there any lessons from your study of the Trump administration that would be useful for our discussion of how Russia conducts information operations, particularly relating to this Second World War issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to spotlight that this can be much less of a surprise to us than it would have been, say, 5 years ago in the United States. To hear Putin justify a war on the basis of denazifying a country with no Nazis, or certainly not Nazis in the government, is unthinkable, and yet it is much more believable in the context of a United States where not just a few people, but millions of Americans to this day right now, and we tend to forget about this because we live inside our little bubbles, but millions of Americans today, the majority of Republicans who identify as Republicans today in the United States, according to polls, believe that Joe Biden was not legitimately elected, and they believe Trump's lies about the 2020 election. And so in the context of that, it is much more credible that millions of Russians could believe Putin's absurd claims about why it is he's launched the war in Ukraine. I don't think that regular Russians think that it's a special military operation as opposed to a war, in the same way that Americans did not think that it was actually just a police action in Korea or in Vietnam, regardless of the lack of a formal war declaration, right? So, propaganda has always had its limits in both societies. But I think the other lesson about Trump, and if he can blow through constraints in a society that is built on the premise of checks and balances for executive power, then you see that the crossing of one previously unthinkable boundary inevitably leads to more and more. And I think that's where the risks of escalation continue to be very significant with Putin and Russia. I think that the question of once you've moved not only yourself, but the country to a different place, you see the risks multiply and become more and more. And so that's where I feel like right now you do see a little bit of perhaps worrisome confidence emerging in Washington and perhaps in other Western capitals, where the initial signs of Russia's military failures in Ukraine, not only in Kyiv, but what appears to be the kind of lack of an initial bolt of success in the regrouping around a campaign in the East. You could see a situation where there's a false confidence that emerges because of the military situation on the ground that once again fails to take into account what may be not only Putin's thinking, but where he's moved the society to. And although you'll see a lot of commentary today and in the following days about how Putin's speech was so much less than met the eye, and what does that mean, and has he recognized, that he's losing. I would just point out that today and in recent days, Putin has continued to double down in the dehumanizing language of a total war against Ukrainians, against the nature of Ukraine as a state and Ukrainians as a people. And when you call your opponents human scum, it makes it much easier to justify atrocities to them, not only past atrocities, but present and future ones. And so I just cannot be sanguine about where we're headed because of that.
No, I think that this is a very important point you've made, that there's not going to be a quick fairy tale ending to this, that whatever happens, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Horrible things are going to happen. And of course, we are the authors of this in the West because we ignored so many warnings over so many years about things going in the wrong direction. But Julia, I want to come to you next and ask you what's missing from our mental toolkit as we try and analyze what Russia's saying when people like Putin say things, because I think that again and again we assume that Putin is a rational actor, but also a rational actor within a framework of priorities and constraints that we find plausible and that make sense. And so then we say things like, well, of course he's not going to go to war. It wouldn't be rational. It would crash the Russian economy. He'd lose all his friends. Xi Jinping wouldn't like it. So there's no way he's going to do that. And I myself am guilty of that. And I'm quite convinced that I'm right on this and just Putin's wrong. Unfortunately, Putin is the president of Russia. So he did things that I was quite convinced he wouldn't do. But from your viewpoint, what would be a few things that we should bear in mind when we look at this Russian propaganda, whether it's Putin's speeches or official other parts of the official discourse, that in order that we don't fall into this trap?
Well, what's very important and revealing in the way Putin's propaganda is approaching this conflict is they're counting on the West's lack of knowledge about historical events, and that's where our media organizations should always fill in the blanks and should always point out the realities of history and point out Putin's continued misrepresentations, the way he is trying to misrepresent the term Nazi, the way he's trying to edge Ukrainians out of the World War II and presenting them on the wrong side of history instead of himself. And the propaganda is actually very revealing in trying to rationalize Putin's behavior, what might seem irrational to us in the West, from Putin's point of view, seemed quite rational, and his propagandists in the run-up to this war have explained why this was supposed to work. They called it a special operation because they were counting on a similar scenario like what happened in Crimea, that it would be quick, relatively painless, the sanctions would be light enough for them to overcome them, and it would be over with a parade in Kiev, which is why they brought their parade uniforms. And of course, nothing went according to the plan because Putin wasn't listening to the real experts. There were some military experts that have predicted that no, the Ukrainians would not be greeting their so-called Russian liberators with flowers. There would be fierce resistance. But instead, it's a closed loop where Putin puts forward messages, his state propaganda reinforces them. They claim they could destroy Ukraine's resistance and take over Ukraine in a matter of minutes, if not days. And of course, now it's a totally different story, which is also very revealing as to where this is headed. Now they're trying to compare this again to World War II, talking about how it took millions of soldiers and years to overcome the Nazi resistance. And they're already trying to prepare the people that this will not be fast and easy as they've originally predicted. So it shows no signs that he's ready to back down anytime soon, and it's a revenge mission against the Ukrainians who rejected him. And it's important for our media, instead of simply repeating his terms and marveling about how inaccurate they are, explaining what he really means by them, which the clues are right there in their own propaganda. And his misuse of the word Nazi should be exposed every single time. When he says Nazi, he simply means someone who rejects the rule and dominance of Russia. It does not mean what the rest of the world might hear when they hear the word Nazi. And it's also important to see how the Russians in their state media are trying to demoralize Ukrainians by talking about their casualties, by misrepresenting them as terrorists. This is what Putin fears, and this is what the West should tirelessly do, and that is describing Russia as a terrorist state, which it has become by initiating this war of aggression. And even before that, when it was poisoning its opponents abroad, even with the way it handled itself and during conflicts in Chechnya and Syria, that needs to be constantly pointed out. This didn't just start out of nowhere. It followed the pattern of escalation of Putin getting away with things, counting on West being feckless, the sanctions being light enough to overcome. Now that he's encountered a totally different kind of resistance, he's not ready for it. And that's why they're framing this conflict now in terms of Russia's conflict with NATO itself, and explaining the delays and difficulties in the entire NATO machine allegedly being against them. And this is what we need to expose, and Putin's own words and his own propagandists give us the clues as what they're afraid of, and this is the way we should continue to pursue it. They're also revealing that the Russians are hesitant to participate and threatening them with an existential conflict, that if Russia were to lose, the Russians would supposedly end up in concentration camps and facing forced sterilization. This shows that the reception domestically is not glowing as the polls would like us to believe.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I, again, do urge everyone to follow you on Twitter and add to your annoyingly huge number of Twitter followers, 270,000, I think more than the rest of us on the call put together. I want to come back to Minister Tuppurainen and Natalia finally, just for some thoughts about how we can puncture this Russian discourse. I'm very struck in the case of Ukraine by the efforts that have been made recently to get across the idea that there's a Ukrainian view on all this. The Ukrainians have intellectual, cultural, religious agency. They're not just a backdrop for a story told by Russia. And there's a particularly good book by Vladimir Yermolenko has came out in 2020 called Ukrainian Histories and Stories, essays by Ukrainian intellectuals, which even as someone who follows this quite closely, I was very struck to find the enormous amount that I didn't know. When you're up against the largest country in the world by land area, and the one thing everybody knows about history is that Hitler was bad, Hitler lost, the Russians got to the Reichstag, it's actually Soviets, but people think that. And you are respectively from Finland and from Ukraine, and you've got to try and get across it's actually a lot more complicated than that. Just in a couple of minutes, what would you say if you were, say, the national security brackets history advisor to your decision makers? What would you say is the most important thing to get across to try and puncture this sort of neo-Soviet war myth? I'll go to you first, Minister Tuppurainen, and then to Natalia for a last word.
Well, I should say that let's keep calm and patient. This is not going to end easily and fast. This is a war of attrition in Ukraine, and even if the atrocities stop, the situation continues. But we cannot allow Putin get what he wants. He wants to create spheres of interest in Europe. And that is something that is totally unacceptable. We have sovereign countries that have their own right to do their own arrangements when it comes to security. And that applies both to Ukraine and to Finland. Even if we are in so different positions, we have the same freedom of choice. Let's stick together. West needs to stay united. only united we can face Russia, and we can do it.
That's not an answer to my question, although it is a very good point. Natalia, what would you say about puncturing the history myth? Is it all about our actions in the present, as the minister was saying, or do we need to dig a bit deeper and actually take on this weaponized history at its source?
To be short, I'm not super optimistic that in a short term we would fix it. These are the decades and decades of the way how the history was told and about the academian sphere. So I do think just a lot of stories, a lot of books from Ukraine and about the Ukrainian history should be told. And there should be some resources for that. My important thing, we need to think about the German and Israeli dependence on Russia in terms of security and energy, respectively, because that's where also the Russian myth stands strongly. And it's, I think it's a lot for the Ukrainian society to be acknowledged as the country who lost one of the most. But I still think that this veto power in the UN is something of Russia, is kind of the greatest abuse of what the world achieved during Second World War is. And having these rights, given these rights to Russia, is really enabling them to play with this myth. So if I give my thoughts to where we work, if it really would matter, it's this direction.
Thank you. Well, of course, that's a very crucial point, is that so much of modern Russia's place in the world rests on the shoulders of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union's place in the world rests on 1945. And if one tugs away at 1945, then not only does our understanding of the Soviet decades that follow it change, but also our understanding of Russia's legitimacy on everything from the UN Security Council permanent membership through to other things as well. I suppose what I'm still missing from this discussion, and probably we'll need another hour or 10 or 100 to do it, is I still feel that a big part of our problem in Europe, and particularly in Germany, is based on this internalization of the Soviet view of history. And again, when I'm talking to Germans, they say, yes, but our relationship with Russia is so complicated because of the war, and we feel so guilty, and we must never again be in war with Russia because that was so bad. And they've basically internalized the kind of neo-Soviet war myth, and they use it as the kind of moral and strategic compass for their contemporary decision-making, with very distorting effects. So perhaps next time we should have this discussion in German and broadcast it to a German audience. I'd certainly be up for that. But we are now out of time. So I will thank you to all the people who've been watching on Twitter. And we didn't take audience questions this time. If we had done, we'd been going on all day, all week, all month, all year. This subject is certainly not going to go away. But I can't tell you what a pleasure it was to have Natalia joining us live from Kiev. You are all so in our thoughts in Kiev. And as the minister said, you're not fighting just for Ukraine, you're fighting for us as well. So thank you for your participation and for everything else. Thank you, Mr. Tuppurainen. I hope the next time we speak, you'll be safely in NATO, or at least underneath the strategic nuclear umbrella of the Allies. It's been a long journey for you, but we are there. Thank you very much, Susan. We can't wait to read your book, The Inside Story of the Trump administration's appalling behavior at home and abroad. It doesn't dent our love for America, but we would certainly want to know more about it. And finally, Julia, thank you very much for your thoughts and for your invaluable Twitter feed. And thank you to my colleagues at SIPA for hosting this. And we look forward to meeting again soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.